In my previous video, I explored the concepts of Gnosticism from a bird's eye view, and I ended up saying that I had some troubles when I first took on the philosophy. I hadn't realized that I was missing a large chunk of the story, so in today's video, I want to explore that in a little bit more detail. But just as a very quick recap, though, for anyone who might have skipped the previous video, who might need a little refresher, the Gnostic narrative presented in the Apocryphon of John is that the creator of the material realm is not the first original God. He's the imperfect, unauthorized son of the spiritual entity Sophia, thought. Actually, more precisely, wisdom. Sophia herself is a spiritual being who descends straight from the original, perfect, monadic God, and after discovering her error and the monstrous world that her son had created, she takes pity on the world's creatures and infiltrates the material realm to place a divine spark of her own self within each of us. Despite being an initially shocking proposition, it's easy to see how appealing the idea might be in a world in which suffering is so common, and it's probably little surprise that Gnosticism has gained a lot of traction over the past few decades, especially in magical circles. Unfortunately, in the often misquoted words of Alexander Pope, a little learning is a dangerous thing, and I want to address in this video how embracing this view, and only this view, can only lead to disaster on a personal but also a global scale. And I want to propose some additional information here that not only sheds light on how this view might be destructive, but how just a little extra information gleaned from, well, other world religions, for example, and even just other texts from the Nag Hammadi library itself, can turn the Gnostic faith into a constructive, life-redeeming, and even life-affirming spiritual philosophy. I spoke in the last video about the events that brought me to the texts and my initial reactions, but now I'd like to share a little bit more about how I experienced those first few years that I spent grappling with this worldview. I think it might be at least partly relevant. After reading the Apocryphon of John, I embraced the Sethian Gnostic perspective wholesale, and with a surprisingly willing mind. The whole narrative seemed to fit so well with what I was experiencing and with everything else that I was reading at the time, and maybe most irresistibly, it was old and it was secret. Two parts of a master key that somehow just gets through to my heart without effort. I don't know why that combination works so well for me and for many people out there, but it does. And in this case, the thing that the key let in was an entire zeitgeist. The belief entered me as easily as a belief that grass is green and that sunshine feels warm on my face, not by any effort of imagination, but rather through a process that feels much closer to recognition or realization. So I realized that the material world was created imperfectly, in contrast to a perfect spiritual realm. It was an aha moment, not a "that's probably right, let me investigate further" moment, which maybe it should have been, but it wasn't. All this to say, this wasn't a philosophy that I was trying on for size. From the very first moments, it became my reality, or should I say it solidified my tentative earlier suspicions into a concrete, firm belief. What followed were actually some pretty difficult years, during which everything I did seemed to be a direct betrayal of this deeper understanding that I had of how the universe works. How does one go about getting a job when the material world is evil and partaking in it makes you complicit? And yet if you don't partake in the world, you can't eat, drink, sleep, do all the things that a human needs to do to survive. For me, the outcome was one of pretty advanced poverty for a long time. I lived for a while on a friend's couch, but I wasn't stupid. I could see that this was only pushing the responsibility onto someone else. I couldn't help the fact that while the divine part of me existed confined in a biological, material body, I had to keep that body alive, or death was the natural ultimate goal. That's quite a thing to live with, I can tell you, particularly when your whole value system is centered around love and compassion. Quite a contrary situation to be in, right? The very reason you despise the material world is for its lack of love and compassion, and yet leaving it would require the ultimate betrayal of love and compassion, accepting to turn yourself into the very thing you sought to flee. So now why flee it? You see how contradictory this whole thing is. Anyway, I lived with this pretty uncomfortable dilemma raging on inside me, and then the issue of love came up. Romantic love, relationship with another individual, the creation of a family. All these things belong to the domain of life, not of death. How could these most sacred concerns, these life experiences that clearly take us closest to the divine, simultaneously be causes of failure if success is measured in how well and how often you end up doing the right thing? And there was another issue, much larger than myself. At the time, former President George W. Bush had just withdrawn America from the Kyoto Protocol, which sought and actually still seeks to address the environmental problems that are causing the global climate catastrophe that we've already started to experience. And I remember thinking at the time, how many Christians are actually going to quietly embrace this? They want to see the end of the world so that the rapture can happen and that they can go and live in what they imagine to be heaven. And I remember thinking how unloving this attitude was and how contrary to the teachings attributed to Jesus too, since he repeatedly calls his followers to be custodians, stewards of the material realm, not wait around until it's gone. And this new Gnostic understanding of the material world's place in the divine order of things would put me in a similarly hypocritical position. Nobody tends to something that imprisons them beyond the bare minimum required to ensure their own survival. Let the thing die, just as long as it's not directly my fault. That's not what a steward does. Not if they want to be able to put their hand on their heart and declare without guilt that they did their best to protect that thing, which is certainly something that I wanted to be able to do. You'll remember how regularly I've stated in the past that despite being far from what most people imagine a Christian to be, the teachings directly attributed to Jesus are my unwavering moral compass. So yes, these were huge problems for me. And so I lived for about 10 years in this kind of paranoid, anxious world, doubting everything that I'd do. Every positive, life-affirming experience would become further fuel for this internal dilemma. And then my son was born. And suddenly I wasn't just making all these compromises to keep myself alive anymore. I was fully responsible for another completely helpless human being. Now, unbeknownst to me, the ideas of Tantrism had slowly been making their ways into my life in the form of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and the vaguely theosophical ideas of the late 19th and early 20th century magical orders. Of course, I didn't know that it was Tantrism at the time. It wasn't until much later that I understood that the Western hypersexualized idea of what Tantra is had very little to do with actual Tantra. But slowly, gradually, the philosophies underpinning the documents of the Golden Dawn and the Thelemic orders were establishing themselves quite comfortably around the pre-existing Gnostic worldview that I'd taken to heart. What was curious was that this additional philosophy absolutely acknowledged the dualist perspective of Gnosticism, but showed it as one perspective of many seemingly contradictory perspectives, which must be embraced and integrated in order to arrive finally at a living, whole, multidimensional perspective that includes precisely the kinds of tensions and dynamic relations that bring Gnosis to life and restore balance to a decidedly imbalanced perspective, which I now see was only imbalanced because it was only part of the story. There were many pieces missing to this puzzle, and one of them was the divine feminine, Bina. What's amazing is that she's right there in the Gnostic narrative, lying latent, waiting for the right moment to appear and make her presence felt. The divine monad has a consort in this narrative, unlike the narrative presented in Genesis. The monad's consciousness is Barbello. And in harmony with this feminine principle, the original power and consciousness create all the other principles until one of the principles creates the creator God in error according to the Apocryphon of John. But we must remember that this text, like most texts in the Bible, are not to be taken literally. If they're taken literally, they're not only inaccurate. I mean, if you believe that the world is 6,000 years old, then you're probably watching the wrong channel here. But they then also fail to disclose their real, essential, esoteric message, which is about something that is beyond the realm of human perception, and therefore can only be formulated through metaphor and simile. And the Bible is such a collection of metaphors and similes. It's only much later that I realized that traditionally the divine feminine would be the first of the three aspects of divinity to which a seeker would be initiated. We read a lot about Judea around the time when Rome invaded in 70 BC, but I think it's also worth thinking about what Rome was like at the time, not from a military perspective, as is usually how we think about Rome, but from a religious perspective. What would the spiritually adventurous pioneers of Rome have been interested in at the time? Well, Rome had invaded Greece 200 years earlier, and a fascination with the Greek mythology was sweeping the empire, with entire rewritings happening, such as Virgil's Aeneid and Ovid's The Metamorphoses. Here and there, Greek-style mystery schools were popping up even as they were dying out in Greece. These weren't anything official, of course. I doubt the government were very happy about this, but still we owe much of our modern knowledge and understanding of the Greek mysteries to the Roman reconstructions. One such source happens to be an author called Lucius Apuleius, who wrote the Metamorphoses, not to be confused with the Metamorphoses of Ovid that we just mentioned. So this Metamorphoses is actually better known as the Golden Asse, and I did a full review of it quite recently on this channel. It's a fictional novel full of sex and magic and various other earthly thrills, but at the end of the novel, the protagonist is initiated successively into three mysteries. First of the mother, then of the father, and then finally of a third kind which he doesn't share in any detail. Now we know that the ancient Egyptians recognized a three-part divine family of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. And since the Greek mysteries and the Egyptian mysteries were closely related, we can suppose, at least, that the third initiation may have been to the mysteries of Horus, whose life closely reflects many of the aspects mentioned in the Gospels about Jesus. As an aside, since Jesus' proclamations about God are so much closer to the Platonic understanding of God than they are to the Hebrew understanding of God, I might argue that a self-respecting Christian might be well served by studying the Greek mysteries into which Plato himself was initiated. That's maybe a topic for yet another video. But returning to the topic at hand, this new threefold perspective helped me to see that the contrary nature of my Gnostic outlook, that imbalance that I'd been experiencing, was simply the result of an incomplete picture. I'd only received the initiation of Osiris, of the father, of the center of the circle. That differentiates itself from the rest by having a position but no dimension. And of course I'd received the initiation into the mysteries of Horus, or their equivalent, of the sun, of the transcendental, and indeed the actual non-dual. What I had missed was the initiation of the mysteries of Isis, of the mother, the circumference of the circle, that which can be sensed, in other words, of the material world. The mysteries of Shekinah, which are all but absent in the traditional Christian narrative, despite being right there for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. To my fascination, in that final chapter of the Golden Asse, the protagonist calls upon the divine feminine in his hour of greatest need. He's been transformed into a donkey and he's going to be slaughtered during a festival to the goddess. He escapes to the sea, and as the moon rises, he prays that the goddess might save him. She arises out of the sea, and there's this glorious description of her, which personally remind me quite directly of the description of the mother figure in the biblical book of Revelation, with her mantle of the sun and the moon at her feet and the 12 stars surrounding her head. Here are the words with which she greets our protagonist. Behold, Lucius, moved by your prayer I come to you, I, the natural mother of all life, the mistress of the elements, the first child of time, the supreme divinity, the queen of those in hell, the first among those in heaven. the uniform manifestation of all the gods and goddesses, I who govern by my nod the crests of light in the sky, the purifying wafts of the ocean and the lamentable silences of hell, I whose single Godhead is venerated all over the earth under manifold forms, varying rites and changing names. Thus the Frisians, that are the oldest human stock, call me Pesinuntia, mother of the gods. The aboriginal races of Attica call me Cecropian Minerva. The Cyprians in their island home call me Paphian Venus. The archer Cretans call me Diana Dictynna. The three-tongued Sicilians call me Stygian Proserpine. The Eleusinians call me the ancient goddess Ceres. Some call me Juno, some call me Bellona, some call me Hecate, some call me Rhamnusia. But those who are enlightened by the earliest rays of that divinity, the sun, the Ethiopians, the Ari, and the Egyptians, who excel in antique lore, all worship me with the ancestral ceremonies and call me by my true name, Queen Isis. Now, the step-by-step description of how exactly the divine feminine eventually manifested within me, not displacing, but complementing, completing the divine masculine and divine child, which had both already been considerably developed by this time, is actually outside of the scope of this video. But I can tell you that embracing the triple nature of the universe, and therefore also of myself, has been the key that has unlocked every remaining door. Well, the ones that I've found so far, anyway. As humans, we are material, dualist individuals, what the Golden Dawn calls the lower self. And we are also the non-dualist, transcendental ground of all being, what the Golden Dawn calls the higher self. And we are the many levels and layers in between. I've talked in the past about how I believe the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, is designed to reconcile all those layers, to bring you together as one, working with a common purpose in unison. I truly believe that embracing this complexity rather than rejecting it is the key to unlocking and realizing our full human nature, the nature that we have the privilege of enjoying. I think we'd be failing at our purpose if we were not to accept to be that bridge between the material and the spiritual worlds. The division already exists. It's not our role to reinforce that division. We are the child Horus. Our role is one of reconciliation. We have to bring the two together, within ourselves and then without. It's a slow process and an uncomfortable one, but as I look around me and see the imbalance in the world, the spiritual poverty on one side and the systematic destruction of the planet on the other, try as I might, I can't seem to think of a more important goal for a lifetime. I speak for myself, of course, but maybe you have thoughts of your own. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to get into how the Gnostic perspective changes the whole approach to grimoire magic too, with its prayers to the many divine names and so on, but once again, that'll have to wait for another video. I certainly hope you enjoyed watching this one, and I hope that if you did, you might consider clicking on that like button so that YouTube knows to suggest this video to other people who might benefit from its perspectives like you. And of course, if you'd like to discuss the topic in more detail, you can always join me for a face-to-face video chat by following the instructions in the description and in the pinned comment. And if you'd like to support the channel on a more ongoing basis, then you might like to consider becoming a member via Patreon or via YouTube from just $2 a month, which gives you access to the Foolish Fish Discord server, among many other perks. All the details are down there in the description. And speaking of members, let me take a moment now to say thank you to every single existing member out there. Your contributions mean the world to me. And let me say a very special thank you to David Venturini, Caitlin Kopok, Linda Hendricks, and Amun for your incredibly kind support at the Lux Eterna Infinity level, and also to all the level 3 Magister Venerabilis members whose names you can see scrolling up on the left there. Thank you once again for watching. Take care of yourselves and of each other, and see you very soon with another video.